Okay. So we are the two GoFar advisors with whom you'd be working. Lauren works with the last names A through L. I work with the last names M through Z. You're welcome at this point to begin setting up individual advising appointments with us by emailing Guffa, G-U-F-A, at georgetown.edu. And we'd be happy to meet with you to begin talking through some of these issues that we're talking about today, talk about your candidacy, looking ahead to the internal application for the Rhodes and Marshall, which is due on June 1st. Okay. So today we're focusing on problems versus issues, because this is an absolutely critical component of any kind of fellowship application. Before you even do anything, it's important to begin thinking about what is the issue area on which you hope to work, because each fellowship application or each fellowship is looking to invest in individuals who have a clear sense of what they're working on, what kind of impact that they hope to have, and they want to see that kind of focus. So this is why this question is so central. And we're going to get into what's the difference between talking about the overarching problems and then the more particular issues. Okay. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. So what is the difference between a problem and an issue? So a problem is something that's enduring, that's amorphous, that's perennial, that you could never hope to change yourself. So a problem might be something like climate change or cybersecurity, the global food crisis, the problem of poverty. So these like larger category types of problems, like data security, any of these kinds of larger categories that you might think of. And so this is a problem is something that regardless of how long you spent working at it, you on your own could never hope to fix it. Perhaps certain individuals nowadays think that they can solve larger problems, but that's not realistic, and that's not something that's we would think is possible. An issue, however, is something that you could do something about within that larger problem. So within the larger problem of poverty, an issue that you might be focused and committed to working on might be the lack of adequate housing in inner cities. Now, even getting deeper, it might be the lack of housing for previously incarcerated individuals. And by not having housing, that increases the rate of recidivism. So a particular issue that falls under that category, that is something that you've developed some expertise in or have some interest in, and that's something that you could imagine being committed to and could come up with or think about future interventions in that space. Or we have the problem of the global food crisis, and a particular issue within that might be the development of biotech that is able to gene edit crops to help them withstand drought and flood, something that's particularly important as we think about climate change. And perhaps you have that background in biotech and that awareness of like food security from perhaps like, I don't know, your classes in SFS that have given you that perspective. Or perhaps your larger problem, because we always have people who are interested in climate change. Obviously, one of the most significant problems of our 21st century. But your issue within climate change might be the regulation of deforestation practices, or thinking about land use initiatives that increase communities' ability to deal with the effects of climate change. So once again, there's a larger category, the larger problems that we might think of that would never be able to be changed, and then an array of issues underneath that problem that you could think about perhaps having interventions around that particular issue. Okay. So I think the emphasis here is focus. We always want to get specific, because you can also think about this if you had multiple candidates, because you're going to have, any of these competitions will probably see multiple candidates dealing with climate change. A selection committee is going to be less convinced by someone who just says, I'm committed to climate change, I'm an environmental person, this is a huge issue that we need to address. And then you have a second person who says, I'm interested in climate change, but in order to start thinking about what we need to do, the point of greatest potential impact, or an intervention that I can imagine having a significant impact, is working on banning single-use plastics, or deforestation is the most critical thing that we should be thinking about now. And I have the data to back up why that's something that I should be focused on. Okay. So how do you arrive at your particular issue within the larger problem? This is going to involve some reflection, introspection, taking stock of the kinds of experiences that you've had to date through your coursework, through other kinds of research experiences, perhaps professional experiences, extracurriculars, thinking about what have you started to gain insight on, where have you started to develop some expertise. And obviously you are still very early in your professional and academic career. It's not expected that you have the scholarly training of someone who's been working on one of these issues for 20 years. But you have gained some sort of initial expertise around a larger problem, around some issues. So your issue should be one that you have already explored deeply through, as I mentioned, the kind of academic, professional, extracurricular. Now, this is not to say, I want to emphasize this is not to say that all of your activities should have been focused on one particular thing. That would seem artificial, unless maybe it has. I don't know. I have yet to find that person. It would seem artificial to say, you know, I have always, since I was age 2, been committed to this particular issue. All of my experiences have focused on this particular issue of deforestation. Now, that's probably not the case. However, your different experiences might have given you some insight into the challenges of dealing with regulating deforestation practices. Perhaps you've had some like legal, like an internship related to like legal frameworks. Perhaps you've taken courses on the environment in some capacity. And these different experiences, while seemingly disparate, have given you some kind of understanding of the challenges and complexity of that issue. So this taking stock is going to allow you to think about, okay, what are the threads that run through my experiences, like the through, or sometimes we talk about the through line, that might be a way of thinking about how you've gained a perspective, different perspectives on a particular issue. The reason this is important is because a selection committee is not going to be convinced by someone who says, you know what, just like last night, I had a dream that I was going to be working on housing on inner cities, and like that's going to be my thing. Because the selection committee and your readers want to see, how has this been something that you've already been committed to? How have you gained the frameworks, the experiences, the tools, the skill sets that's going to enable you to have that kind of impact? And if it's just something that just like arose, you know, in the last like couple days, last week, it's not going to be something that convinces them of the seriousness of your commitment and your ability to affect change in that kind of space. And related to this, to my comment about it might seem artificial to say that like, oh, you know, all my experiences have focused on this particular issue. You know, life isn't linear. So it could be that you started off college focused on one particular topic, or thinking that you were going to be really interested in data privacy, data security. And as you went along, and as you perhaps took seminar courses, or perhaps as you did a research experience, you realized, you know what, that initial kind of problem, those issues within that problem are interesting to me. But what really fascinates me is how these issues affect under-resourced communities who don't have the ability to have a say in like data privacy. So perhaps like there's some pivots in your academic career, and those pivots are actually really interesting. It shows that kind of development, that evolution, which is really interesting and makes for a really, I think, compelling narrative for these kinds of applications. So don't be disheartened if you think, you know, I haven't like been focused on this particular issue my entire like high school and undergraduate experience, but think about what experiences have I had that have really informed my perspective, that have allowed me to gain this really interesting take on this issue. And Lauren and I are here to help you think through that narrative. That's our job. So coming to us with a sense of like, I've taken stock of my experiences in this when I'm thinking, we can work with that. So that's kind of like mold that clay. Perhaps it's a little bit too artsy. But anyway, so those are the kinds of things we think about. Also, it's important. Sorry, Lauren, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in real quick to underscore, you know, some of the points around what we provide in terms of student advising. So I think that there's this one, perhaps like default assumption around, it's like, oh, we have information to impart, or we can like help in the final stages with like editing, but that's not really what we do. One of the most important things that I hope you're picking up when it comes to thinking about the difference between the issues and the problems, and where you land in terms of how all these pieces come together and how you're building a narrative that supports, demonstrated sustained interest in a certain space and, projecting that into the future through your vision. But we are here to kind of help you through the discernment process, if you will. So there are ways in which, if you're having kind of a challenge and you've done an inventory and you're trying to think about ways that these pieces come together, we don't get people that come to the ready to apply for a UK fellowship with all of these things totally figured out. One of the best things about going through the process, and also going through the process with someone that can help you elicit that through conversations and advising, is that you'll be able to define that as you go. So you can't show up the day before the internal application deadline and just throw all your stuff out there. But you can, even if you don't maybe have the crystallized vision, you can develop that over time. But again, that takes a little bit of kind of self-reflection, and also in many instances, it helps to have an exchange with an advisor. So we can just really ask you questions that are meant to help you identify kind of where your primary interests are, because I feel like there's so many moments in advising sessions where you got a lot, there's not just one, and you're like, well, how do I pick? All these things are motivating my interests, and you do need a pick. You can't be doing everything. I think one of the challenges is, I'm going to let the fellowship kind of allow me to explore the next phase of these 14 interests. That's not going to work. And so many times this material today is sort of hopefully communicating to you the need to narrow and specialize and start making some decisions. And that can be hard because it means you're letting some of those things you care about, at least in terms of the narrative, go a little bit.
And that ties in nicely to the second point, that this issue is one that you envision being a focal point of your future career. Now, this is not to say that what you put down is a contract. The fellowship is not going to come to you in 10 and 20 years and be like, well, I'm sorry, you're now in this other kind of field and you know what, we're revoking your fellowship. That's not the case. But they do want to understand, how have you, what kinds of experiences do you have? What does that prepare you to do? What is your focal point at this period in time? Because once again, they want to invest in that narrative. They want to invest in that future impact. So there could be an array of types of future paths that you see yourself going down. But for the purpose of this application, for the purpose of thinking about how does this fellowship and graduate program fit into my future career, it's going to require picking one of those paths. So as Lauren said, specializing is going to be really important for the purpose of this application. And I like to call this a thought experiment. I really like to call this a thought experiment because it is kind of a fun thing to think about, okay, what is the potential here? Where can I go with the experiences that I've had and expertise I've started to develop? Okay. So how does this relate to the application? It's a matter of thinking about what is your case. And a committee is convinced by an issue that is significant and urgent. We want to know, why is it so critical to be working on this particular issue? What are the kinds of changes or developments happening around that issue that we need to be paying attention to? So convincing us that this is something that's significant and that's urgent, oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, using data and using information to convince us that that's the case. And then also that you have the potential to be a leader in the future in that issue. And once again, that comes from demonstrating the commitment to that issue, demonstrating your perspective gained from an array of experiences and how that's allowed you to think through the complexity of something, because any of these issues is going to be inherently complex. And so how, once again, your array of experiences given you that interesting perspective, that ability to be creative and innovative when it comes to thinking through that issue. And how have those experiences influenced your way of thinking about those particular issues? So this is your case. This is the case you're making in the application, getting us excited to invest in you as a future leader and getting us excited to invest in you given the critical nature of the issues that you're working on. Oop, okay, moving too quickly here. Okay, what to avoid. And so these are a few of the issues, speaking of issues or problems, a few of the problems that we often see with fellowship applications, especially at this early stage in the process. I think there's a temptation when we think about being a leader and having an impact, being a change agent. I think there's a temptation there for people to think that they have to be the sole practitioner, that kind of like, I alone can fix this, that you need to kind of inflate your position within all this in order to convince a committee that they should invest in you. Actually, that accomplishes the opposite thing. When you talk about yourself as a sole practitioner, it shows that you don't understand, or perhaps don't have a pragmatic sense of how change happens and who's involved in change in that space and how you would be contributing to that change. So as I said, these issues are complex, and one couldn't pretend that you yourself are going to fix it, especially at this early stage in your career and your development. So you were very early on. It's acknowledging that you were early on, but you have some sense of like, these are the potential intervention points. So also avoiding speaking about the language of solutions. You're not going to fix anything. I think that's important to start off now. I mean, we have great confidence in your future abilities, but at this point in time, you are not going to fix anything. You are not going to fix the housing crisis. You are not going to fix deforestation at this point in time. It's thinking about the kinds of interventions that can help address the issue rather than the language of solutions. Because once again, the language of solutions perhaps indicates that you don't yet understand how to begin affecting change on these issues, which also relates to underestimating the issue itself. As I mentioned, like, once again, the complexity. I can't underscore enough that any of these issues are complex. So you want to understand that or underscore that you understand the nuances of that issue. And also choosing an issue that's too broad. And that, as Lauren mentioned, this is also something that, in our individual advising appointments, we can help you think through the issue itself, help you get to that specificity and clarity that's going to be required of this trajectory. But once again, the summary of this page would be, we want to understand that you have a sense of how change happens, how to affect that change, what it's going to take. And that's going to involve recognizing who else is working on these issues, what developments have been made, what trends are happening, to show that you have that potential to be a leader because you understand the landscape. Okay, moving on. Okay, so this leads to the trajectory piece. Next steps in the development of your application is thinking about, okay, what have you done about it? As we discussed, taking stock of your experiences. What do you intend to do about it? Which comes from recognizing the landscape of that issue. What are potential interventions? And it's not enough to say that change should happen. So it's not enough as you prepare your application to say, like, well, obviously, this is an issue. The fact that I'm drawing attention to the fact this is an issue shows I'm a leader. No. It's not enough to say that change is necessary, because obviously change should be necessary and for any of these problems. What you need to be thinking about are what are types of interventions that can begin to address a bit of the complexity of that issue. And thinking about how will this fellowship and degree assist you in doing more about that issue in the future. So you've already developed some expertise, but you're still early in your academic and professional development. And this is why this becomes part of the rationale of how the kind of training you get on the fellowship program and the fellowship itself in terms of the community and such are going to prepare you, get you closer to that set of goals that you've outlined. And once again, this is where we come in. This is our role as fellowship advisors, is to help you think through these steps. Okay. So defining the vision. So we've talked about thinking about, okay, what is an issue or two that you've begun to really examine through your experiences. Now it's a matter, in terms of thinking about this trajectory, to define the vision, define the endpoint, the capacity in which you will be operating and in which you hope to make a difference. And specificity and clarity of vision are absolutely critical to a fellowship application. So there are many different ways to do this, but I think a couple things that are important to help you achieve the specificity is thinking about models of individuals who are doing this work currently that you find, you think are at the forefront of the field, are visionaries in that regard, or models of organizations, institutes, what have you, that are also involved in affecting change in the space or committed to addressing these issues. And those models can serve as a blueprint for thinking about your own development. So when you look to see, okay, who's really at the forefront in this space, who's really a leader in this field, reading their bio, seeing like what kind of training have they pursued, how have they gotten to where they're going, where they are now, and thinking about how can I use that sort of template for thinking through my own development. What kind of training will I need? What kinds of professional types of positions might I pursue in order to kind of get to that space? That type of research is important because once again, it shows that you have a pragmatic sense of how change happens, of how to get to the point of affecting change in that space. And it also makes sure that the match is there, that you're not proposing something that you don't by any means have the kind of background to do, or proposing a program that doesn't make sense given what you want to do. So the models are really important. And it's also important to think about the trends and innovations happening in that field. So what are the challenges? Like, what is this field going to look like 20 years from now? As we think about deforestation or as we think about land use initiatives, what's happening in this space? What are the kinds of things that you should be aware of? Doing some research, talking to, and this is where talking to your faculty mentors can be really, I think, useful and important because they can give you a sense of like, who else should you be reading? What kinds of what journals should you be reading? News articles, to get a sense of these are the challenges, that you are aware of who's working in this space so that you can better position yourself in that space in the future and show that you understand not only the complexity, but how things are evolving. Which leads us to, what is the type of leader you hope to be? I think it's also important. So there's I think a scale issue here. So I think sometimes we have people who are, like, for instance, are involved in international affairs, say, you know what, I really am interested in the Foreign Service. My future goal is to be a Foreign Service officer. That is a noble and meaningful goal. But I think the committees would want to know, okay, what is going to be a role that you have that has a larger ability to affect change on a wider scale? So it might be the Foreign Service interests you, but perhaps in the future, this leads you to be involved in one of the bureaus at the office of this, or at the State Department. So thinking about what is going to be the role that is the end point here, that is perhaps not the near term, is the end term, that's going to allow me to have that kind of change. So making sure it is something that convinces the committee that you are going to have that greater impact in your field and around the issues that you hope to address. And then once again, what types of interventions you hope to make. Goes back to my point about it's not just enough to say that change needs to happen, but that you at this point in time have recognized the intervention points. And it's not that you need to propose solutions, because once again, you're not proposing solutions, but you're helping us understand that you understand the challenges and the complexities around this issue and have a sense of where you can begin to have that change. So just as like an example of like how you might think about like researching models. So I often have, like this last year, I feel like I had a lot of people who were interested in like the World Resources Institute, this like global nonprofit that is working to address lots of issues. So say you were interested in like issues of sustainability, were interested in issues of like urban design. And so that led you to think about, okay, let's see what we do, topics. They have sustainable cities is one of the areas on which they focus. So if I was interested in the issues of sustainability, issues of urban design, that kind of thing, and I could envision myself working for the World Resources Institute in the future, I would look to see, okay, what is happening at the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities? What are the kinds of projects that they're working on? This also might give you insight into like the kind of data or the kinds of reports that you should also be reading to back up your argument about why this is a significant issue. So I would start reading about what it is they do. Let's see, they have their own website here. See what they're involved in, what are their critical projects, and here like get to the staff, like see where have these people been, what have they done, to look at their profile, and this once again is going to give you ideas of perhaps professional trajectories to think about for yourself, and give you the kind of language and the frameworks to use to talk about the kind of impact that you want to have in the future. So this is just an example, like one type of organization that might be that you really admire what the work that they're doing, the kind of like more global impact, and would be interested for working for them. That might give you an idea. I mean, like they work in other kinds of areas as well, but just an idea of where to get started in finding those kinds of models. But just would also reiterate that talking to your faculty mentors can be really helpful in this way too. You want to think about approaching a fellowship as assembling your team, assembling people who can help you think through this vision and the issues and your impact. And so Lauren and I are really, I think, well positioned to help you think through the larger trajectory here. Your faculty mentors can really help you think through the issue and think through the kinds of things that I spoke about here: trends and innovations, challenges, who should you be reading, who are the kinds of people who are at the forefront of this space, and that's going to help you think through the pieces of this as well. And actually, I think last week we mentioned the applicant toolkit on our website, and one of our handouts is actually about assembling the team and recognizing who should you be turning to when to think through these different aspects of your proposal. Okay. So this all comes back to assessing and revisiting the fit. So as you're doing this work, you might continue to refine and think about the fit here, thinking about how these past puzzle piece type of experiences have prepared you for or laid the foundation for a certain set of goals, and thinking about, okay, what are the goals here? Do I have the experiences that demonstrate my commitment to that particular space? So if you were interested in working at the State Department in the future in one of the bureaus, but hadn't yet like done anything in your past that indicated like you had an intern with the State Department before, if that was like something that really interested you, there might be like some like fit issues to think through, like, okay, what is the best space in which to have, in which to operate? What kind, given the interventions that you want to have, what is the best kind of organization, institute, place to be doing that kind of work? So it's constantly, I think, assessing and revisiting that fit to make sure that that trajectory makes sense given what you want to do. And eventually we'll get into talking about recommenders, but I just wanted to make a note here that as you're thinking about the fit, thinking about, okay, who are going to be the recommenders who can speak to and validate these types of connections, who can speak to how through your academic experiences or professional experiences, you've laid this groundwork and are well equipped and have the potential to succeed in the vision that you have outlined. So that's going to be an important piece later on that we'll talk about in our one of our future workshops. Okay. Everything that we've just talked about is critical to the internal application that you'll be putting forward on by the June 1st deadline, because our 2 short essay responses in that internal application speak to precisely these issues. The first one is, what is the issue in which you intend to apply your expertise, and in what capacity do you seek to make an impact? So it's going to require that that specific type of issue and that specific set of end goals that serve as the anchor for the rest of your application. So everything that you're going to be doing in the next several weeks and thinking through, okay, taking stock of my experiences and thinking about, okay, where might that lead in the future, is going to serve as the basis of this internal application. And the second piece of this is what experiences have prepared you for this work and how have they informed and deepened your perspective. So once again, thinking about being specific, what are the kinds of perspectives or insights that you have gained from the work that you've done, and how has that affected how you're thinking through the complexity of this issue and the interventions that need to be made? I think the emphasis here is how you're thinking through something. Once again, you're not proposing solutions, but we want to know how, given your experiences, has that given you a framework, a way of understanding the kinds of issues that you're working on? So these serve as the foundation for the application for internal endorsement, and these are the only short essay responses that you will be speaking to in that application. Lauren, did you have anything else from that?
From the point you're on now, no, but we have a question when we get to question and answers.
We have a question?
Yeah. In the chat box. I don't think it's about the leadership, so we can
okay
hold it till the end. But it's more
Well, those are the main comments I wanted to make about the issue versus problem. And we can get to, oh, why isn't our logo appearing? Uh-oh, our beautiful logo is not here. Just imagine our logos right here. This is representative of the kind of like space you want to go. It's something to think through and imagine. But our next workshop is going to be on Wednesday, April 15th at 1 p.m. And that's going to be on graduate program selection. So as we think about the fit again, the kinds of pieces that come together here, one of the puzzle pieces is this graduate program that you will be proposing for the roads and for the or for the Marshall. And the Marshall in many cases is going to require like perhaps like 2 programs. So the graduate program selection becomes critical to helping us understand how you are thinking through the training that you will need in order to get to where you want to go. But this work of kind of thinking through the end goal is going to help you think about what programs you need, what kind of training, disciplinary training do people who are at the forefront of this field have or need to get to where they want to go. So this is going to be a really critical topic to talk about as well. And our applicant toolkit on our website includes some helpful handouts, includes that assembling your team handout that I spoke about, and also the guide to preparing competitive fellowship application, which also touches upon some of the points that we've just discussed too. So that can be a helpful reference point as well. If there are questions, then we can, let's see, let me go back up. What's happening here?
I do think that on the on the next workshop, the graduate program selection, that's sort of a really important one to take quite a bit of time researching and making sure that you have right. We'll be giving some tips for how to do that. But if you think about your fellowship application as a pitch, the good that you're asking for, like the thing that you're saying, like, here's all my skills and qualifications, please consider for me for this, is the degree program that you're proposing. So your degree program has to be very closely linked to the work that you've done, an acknowledged skill set that you need to develop that has a value add for the area that you're pursuing and hoping to make a change in. And then that also has to prepare you for what would come after the fellowship. Like, I have now the skill sets that I need to move forward into the next step of this vision action plan. So if you think about it, like, how many programs off the top of your head can you think about at the graduate level that exist in the UK? Probably very few, right? So there's going to be quite a bit of research so that you understand, one, how just the field of higher education operates in the United Kingdom, which is slightly different from the United States, and how our graduate programs are kind of at least termed, or, you know, the length of them, et cetera. And 2, making sure that you're not just picking a degree program at an institution because you've just heard of that institution. There are a number of really good programs across the United Kingdom. And in fact, for the Marshall, depending upon where you choose to go, it can have a slight impact on your competitiveness, because we are going to be very sort of, I want to say, like, we're going to make sure and urge you to consider programs that sit outside Oxford and Cambridge and LSE and some of the London schools. Now, if you find the best program, and heck, it's at Oxford, whatever, like, we're not going to keep you from proposing that. But we really want to make sure that you're not just picking Oxford or Cambridge because those are the institutions that you've heard of. You have to have a really sound rationale for why those programs, which means who's teaching there, what kind of faculty are doing scholarship there, what are you getting? Anyway, all that stuff will come out on Wednesday, and we'll get back now to some of the more relevant questions from this. But I'm just saying, if you can't catch this one, it's still worth at least viewing, because it's going to help you go a long way in doing some of the research that really needs to be done to put forward the tightest pitch. So I guess the question that, Laura, I'll ask you and you can answer it.
Yeah, that's one from, how can I talk about my leadership capacity without appearing like I'm a sole practitioner? Okay, so I think the emphasis here is on lessons that you've gained from your leadership experiences. So when it comes to taking stock of your experiences and how they've enabled you or given you some initial insights or skill sets to tackle an issue or begin to address an issue, it's thinking about what lessons have you gained. So in the kind of extracurricular experiences that you've had, in the process of bringing together different stakeholders to think about working on a particular issue, on perhaps sustainability, what are the kinds of challenges that you confronted, that perhaps you successfully confronted, or perhaps you didn't successfully or were unsuccessful in that regard? And how has that insight that you've gained from that experience informed how you're thinking about the challenges and or complexity of the issue? This is also different than from like a leadership essay. So there's different ways in which leadership experiences might factor into your application. One is, once again, giving you these, as I mentioned, the perspective skill set tools to think about affecting change in your area. And the other could be for the Marshall application, but that's not necessary for this internal application. But the eventual Marshall application does have a leadership essay that asks about your leadership. And for that, they want to better understand who you are as a practitioner, how you think about, and once again, a lot of this comes back to like how you think through something, how you think about affecting change, or how you've sought to identify a problem and work to resolve it. So the emphasis there is more so on like how you're operating rather than like you were the leader or you achieved something on your own. Lauren, is there something you would add to that?
Yeah, I will underscore something that you already said. Number one, when we're talking about leadership, that's just a huge umbrella term. It means a ton of different things. So like context, and this is important because all of this sort of coaching, feedback, support that we're offering you, how to think about and design your future with fellowships, all of that right now is sort of unhinged from an actual application prompt, right? So we're helping you think through things that have implications for the ways that you approach specific essays. So there are two specific writing elements to the internal application, and neither one of them necessarily talks specifically about you as a leader, although leadership would be imbued in whatever, and how you're talking about your issue, just I think as a natural course of action. But to the question around leadership, as a sole practitioner, because this comes up in a lot of different elements across many types of fellowship applications, or even in a cover letter. There's that fine line between being like, I did it all myself, aren't I great? And then actually like erasing yourself from the work and the contribution that you actually did put forward as a leader. So one, even asking that question is important because it helps you like develop a barometer that allows you to understand how rhetorically your tone is coming across when you talk about achievement. And that's something that takes a little bit of time to understand how to get right. One of the things that you can do is absolutely acknowledge all of the people, the elements, whether it's, it was happenstance or coincidental or whatever, that allowed for the success, if you're talking about a success story in leadership, right? So instead of thinking about how often do you use I when you should have used a we, right? Those are subtle things that can help. However, if maybe you did do everything, like maybe you designed something, you implemented it, you went rogue, whatever, you became a, crazy leader in your own right, you can still subtly and rhetorically acknowledge all of the elements, whether they're privileged or whether you had a mentor that like helped you shape your thinking so that when you implemented your entrepreneurial whatever, like you remembered a thing that a great mentor once taught you, so you drew on that learning to implement, so that there's ways that you can talk about the embedded network of activities that came together, and you are one important node in that, but you are not the single node. And I think it's hard to explicate in an abstract or hypothetical way, but when you get to a real situation where you're like, here's how I led, well, actually, one of the things that you can do is do an inventory. What allowed for me to have that success? All of it, write it all out. It's 14 people that did this. It's my father that always told me this thing that I keep with me to this day. It was happenstance that I ran into all those things, because that can be ways that you can subtly draw on those things to show that you actually have an awareness of how your engagement did bring a return, but at the same time, your success is also hinged on a lot of other things that you don't always necessarily have 100% control over. Other questions? Chat box, or people we have a few minutes. This is pretty much the session, I think, so you can hang around, you can go. I'm going to be leaving here pretty quickly for another meeting, but it would be great if people actually wanted to just sort of like ask a question, hear your voice, or if you prefer to chat in the chat box, that's fine too. I'm going to mute myself while I eat a chip.
I still remember a friend of mine who actually is now famous, side note, who used to eat carrots when we took exams in high school, and it was the most annoying thing, and I still remember it, the frustration of trying to focus and hearing carrots. So
I've
thank you,
had someone
Lauren.
eat an apple in a meeting. It's just like,
Someone did?
you're like, what are you doing?
Or we
Yeah,
also
like,
know people who've eaten nuts during interviews.
yeah, it can be distracting. I mean, if you're on a one-on-one meeting, you can bring your apple into my office. But like, if you're in like an important professional meeting, just crunching on an apple is just like, you can't focus.
I know, and it's hard to also contain the juices of an apple as you're eating it.
The whole
So
thing just made
yeah,
no sense.
there's a lot that are problematic there.
Super problematic.
Anybody have any other comments or questions? Or I just noticed these great recommendations here too for my board games.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, we got one there, Laura.
Do you need to have had experience with a very specific issue you want to focus on, or can you talk about how related experience in academic study have led you to choose care about the specific issue? Okay. I think it's important to have had some I hate the word exposure. Once again, I say that it sounds so indecent. Some experience with the issue that you're working on, because we want to know how you've already begun developing a framework for thinking through the issue, how you've begun to explore that issue in some way. Once again, it doesn't need to be that everything has focused on that issue, but I would want to see if you were interested in issues regarding deforestation, like perhaps you've done a research project that included thinking about deforestation in some capacity, or you've engaged in internships that have allowed you to think about that as one of the things you focused on. So it could be like that issue was one of many that you have thought about, but we need to understand how your broader set of experiences have given you a perspective for addressing that kind of issue in the future. So both here, I would say, have had some experience. It doesn't need to be like, once again, every single thing has focused on that experience, but that issue should be one of the ones that you've dealt with. And then it is important to talk about how experiences have led you to care about that issue. Because as I spoke about, those kinds of pivots early, as I mentioned, I think it was like on the first, one of the first slides. Oops. Here, that the discussion of how like different sets of experiences have led you to that particular issue, those kinds of pivots, I think are some of the most interesting, make for an interesting narrative, those kinds of swerve moments that you were thinking about something and that made you actually interested in like, oh, there's not much known about this, or there's a gap in our understanding about this particular issue. So then that led you in that direction. That's an interesting intellectual autobiography that oftentimes becomes the material to use in a personal statement.
I might just also say there's three things here. One, you're also super young, you guys. You're not supposed to like have had 15 years experience in something, because like that would mean you were like 7 when you started doing, well, like even younger or whatever, right? So I think that it's hard. The question is of related positionality. So how far afield from the thing that you want to do is your current experiences, and how do you think about maybe the degree program itself is a kind of step that helps you get to that space where you want to make a difference. So for example, one of our more recent Marshall recipients had proposed a degree program in urban design and planning, has no background in that, has done a lot of development work, looked at the ways in which sort of cities themselves become interesting spaces for enabling certain types of, you know, development or change or economic prosperity from the Foreign Service, development focused, right? Looking to go to the UK to do urban studies and planning, to move some of those concepts still in a larger like area space, right? But then wants to look at an intervention point that uses the frameworks of urban planning and design. No background in that, totally fine, because the rationale and the positioning of the sort of centerpiece for what, you know, she wanted to get involved in and how she wanted to affect change made sense. So a lot of this actually kind of depends on like how the many pieces are coming together. And again, sometimes that takes an outside person to just walk through different scenarios with you, like have conversations. This is also something you can talk to your academic mentors about. It's also a pretty good thing to just a good excuse to go catch up with your recommenders that you might be asking for recommendation you might want to spend some of these ideas that you may be having around where you're going to go next and what degree program you want to do through the fellowship opportunity with mentors. Then they might even parrot some of that back in their letters for you. And so some of the ways that you can also get, I think, credentialed or like given acknowledged credibility in that space is by having your recommender say that this step also makes sense for you, even though it's not smack on what you've been doing.
Yeah. Oh, we have a hand. Yay. Anya, you can speak.
First, thank you so much for doing this. This is super, super helpful. My question pertains to figuring out, like, kind of naming the position that you want to have or make change within. And I was kind of wondering how specific we should be when we do talk about that, or do you think about that? Is it more kind of general, you know, I want to work for this organization, or I want to work in this bureau, or is it a very pointed, like, I want to be this person?
Good question. Yeah, so I wouldn't expect someone to be like, I'm going to be the associate vice president of this particular organization, like defining like that exact role, but I want to know in what capacity do you hope to be having an impact? So it doesn't entail knowing, okay, what is the kind of office or what is the kind of institute, what is the kind of team that engages in those kinds of questions. It doesn't need to be at the granular level of saying, I hope to be this exact position. I just kind of want to know, do you understand the organization, the space that's making those kinds of changes currently that you could see yourself operating within?
And honestly, that would be a wonderful problem if you got too specific, because most 99
are too vague.
It's like, I'm going to do State Department, or I'm going to, like, you know, work at a not-for-profit that does environmental stuff. And you're just like, that doesn't mean, that's not enough.
Oh, and another pet peeve that just made me think of it, Lauren. Do not just tell us you want to be a thought leader.
Oh yes, this is what
people always say, I'm going to be a thought leader in cybersecurity. We're like, what the heck does that mean? Also, in order to be a thought leader, you first need to have expertise and be serving a type of role that allows you to have that kind of thought leadership.
Again, that's why even just having a little bit of a conversation with the fellowship advisor keeps you from becoming like putting that forward and not knowing that that's either, you won't know it's cliched if you haven't read hundreds of these. And since we've read hundreds and hundreds of them, we can tell you what does and does not resonate, what is specific, what is not specific enough. But honestly, if you came and you said, I want to be this person, so long as it's not like wildly like hubristic, like I want to be Secretary of State, like so long as it's not too crazy, if you came with something really specific because that person's doing awesome work, then we can help you shape a narrative that positions yourself in the field without over relying on the ascription of the exacting position. But oftentimes people start further back and we have to kind of force you to get more specific. But I mean, like, if there's one thing, and then I'm going to go and I'll let Laura finish up. If there's one thing, it's like you almost, on most things, whether it's your, you know, defining the problem, whether it's like, you know, what your future career trajectory is, how you want to make a change, we often are driving people to more specificity, almost like a research project. Have you ever written a paper and they're like, too broad, too broad, too broad, too broad, narrow, narrow, narrow? With your life, you've got to do the same thing for this. And with that, I will see you guys later. Hopefully I see everyone here today at next week's workshop. Thanks for bearing with me as I like have children and chips and like kind of.
What flavor were they?
Well, they were good. They were cheddar sour cream, but they were baked. So they were, I know.
Cheddar sour cream. Oh.
Okay, fine. I guess I called your like pandemic dumb, so you get to call my chips disgusting.
Oh, you also criticized my tea choice last week too.
Oh, did I? Oh, yes. Well, I do that in the most like collegial way.
Yeah. I'll hang around for a few more minutes if anybody else has questions they'd like to address or raise. We can also talk about board games. You know, I'm just really excited about expanding my board game collection. Any final questions, comments? Okay. And just to emphasize, you don't have to be shifting paradigms in the kind of thing you're proposing. I once had someone who wanted to like invent economic history, and I said, no, economic history has existed for a long period of time. So one, like also making sure that you understand the field to indicate these are actual needed interventions and haven't already been achieved. But also, once again, recognizing that you are still early in your career, and this is why you are applying to do the kind of training or fellowship that you are applying to do, because that's actually going to give you the needed toolkit to advance in the kind of path you want to go down. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope to see you next week on Wednesday, April 15th for our graduate program selection. And in the meantime, if you want to be setting up individual advising appointments, feel free to email. Here's our email address here, guffa@jerusalem.edu, and we'll be happy to meet with you. Okay.
Thank you.
Adios.
Thank you.